I'm a high school history teacher, and by popular demand, today I'll be discussing Call of Duty Black Ops 2. Recently I've played World at War, Black Ops 1, and Cold War in preparation for Black Ops 6. In those videos I gave some historical context for the events of the games as we played straight through each mission, but this video is going to be a little different. Black Ops 2 takes place in 2025 with some levels flashing back to the 1980s. I'll start by describing the flashback levels and the historical context for each of them. Then I'll take a look at the world in 2025 according to Black Ops 2 and compare it to our world today to see what they got right. This was my first time playing this game, so my apologies if I get anything wrong or if I miss anything. Without further ado, let's get right into this. The first mission of Black Ops 2 is a flashback to July 1986 during the Angolan Civil War. Let's start with the background. In 1482, the Portuguese made contact with the Congo Empire in modern-day Angola, quickly establishing forts and settlements along the coast to participate in the transatlantic slave trade. Fast forward to the 19th century, and Portugal is now interested in expanding to the interior of the continent. In 1884, representatives of several major world powers met in Berlin to discuss terms for European control over the African continent. This led to the scramble for Africa, in which Portugal and other nations quickly moved to seize as much land as possible. Thus, the territory of Angola was born. Inspired by the independence of Ghana in 1957 and the Congo in 1960, the Angolan War of Independence began in 1961. After over 13 years of fighting and a leftist coup in Portugal that overthrew their government, Angola became independent in 1975. Sadly, a civil war immediately broke out between the two biggest factions. There was the Communist People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola, or MPLA, which was supported by the Soviet Union and Cuba, and there was the anti-communist National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, or UNITA, supported by the United States and South Africa. South Africa was also fighting a border war with Namibia and Angola at the same time, but for the sake of this video I won't get into that conflict. The Angolan Civil War was incredibly long and brutal, lasting from 1975 all the way to 2002, with some periods of peace sprinkled in. After hundreds of thousands of deaths and millions displaced from their homes, the MPLA was eventually victorious. Millions of landmines still litter the Angolan countryside to this day, claiming new victims every year. In this first mission, we play as Mason looking for our old buddy Woods, who was captured by Cubans in the MPLA. On our side is Jonas Savimbi, the real-life anti-communist leader who founded UNITA and fought against the MPLA through the Civil War. Savimbi was one of the leading anti-communist voices in the world until his death in 2002, and he received plenty of support from the US during the Angolan Civil War. Savimbi gives us a machete and inspires his troops to hunt down the MPLA to the last man. Fighting through the jungle, we reach the Kubanga River and rescue Woods, who barely survived in this shipping container full of corpses. As we make our escape, we encounter Raul Menendez for the first time, who gets shot in the face during the fight. More on him later. The next flashback mission in Black Ops 2 takes place a couple months later, in September 1986 during the Soviet-Afghan War. Again, let's start with some context. In the late 19th century, the British and Russian empires both wanted control over Afghanistan to use it to their advantage against the other. Borders of influence were agreed upon in the 1880s, which lasted until the end of World War I. Britain conceded Afghanistan's independence from them in 1919, and the newly founded Soviet Union quickly took interest in Afghanistan. The Soviets wanted to use Afghanistan as a forward operating base for revolutionary activities in British India. Throughout the 20th century, the Soviet Union influenced Afghan politics as the US and China sought to influence Pakistan and other surrounding countries. In 1973, Mohammad Daoud Khan overthrew his cousin, the King of Afghanistan, and established the Republic of Afghanistan. Although Daoud was cordial with the Soviets, he maintained a policy of neutrality in the Cold War. The People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, or PDPA, was founded in 1965. Tensions between them and Daoud's government continued to grow until 1978 when the PDPA overthrew Daoud and executed him. The PDPA were supported by the Soviet Union, of course, and in their first 18 months of rule they set out on a program of communist modernization. This upset many religious groups in Afghanistan who felt that the new government was opposed to Islam. It wasn't long before rebellion began, led by the jihadist organizations like the Mujahideen. In December 1979, the Soviet army invaded Afghanistan at the request of the PDPA to help stabilize the situation. The US, seeing an opportunity to counter the Soviet Union while improving relations with other Muslim countries, began supporting the Mujahideen with weapons and CIA training. The Soviet-Afghan War lasted all the way until 1989 and was one of the contributing factors to the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. More on that in the next video. Back in the game, we play again as Mason, assisting the Mujahideen in their defense against a Soviet attack on their compound. We're joined by the fictional Tian Zhao, our contact from China. Now, why would the communist Chinese be assisting the Mujahideen, who are fighting the Soviet Union? It's a complicated story, but here are the basics. In 1949, the communist Chinese, led by Mao Zedong, were victorious in the Chinese Civil War. The US-backed nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek fled to Taiwan. During the Korean War, Chinese troops supported North Korea, ensuring the survival of the Kim dynasty and the communist regime. In 1964, China detonated their first atomic weapon, and throughout the Vietnam War, they supported the North Vietnamese against the US. However, in the early 70s, as Cold War tensions cooled in the era of détente, the US saw an opportunity to drive a wedge between the Chinese and the Soviets. In 1971, the American ping pong team was invited to China, the first Americans allowed in since 1949. In February 1972, President Nixon became the first American president to visit China. This series of events began a warming of relations between the US and China that culminated in the US officially recognizing the People's Republic of China in 1979. Meanwhile, Sino-Soviet relations had been deteriorating since the death of Stalin in 1953. In 1969, the Soviets and the Chinese fought an undeclared war for 6 months over border disputes in Manchuria and Xinjiang. Throughout the 70s, the two communist countries were unable to repair the relationship, and the US swooped in to get China on their side. Therefore, when the Soviet-Afghan War broke out in 1979, China also began supporting the Mujahideen. This is why we have Tian Zhao as an ally in Afghanistan in the game. So Woods, Mason, and Zhao go out and repel some Soviet attacks before witnessing a massive assault on the Mujahideen compound. We see that Kravchenko somehow survived the events of Black Ops 1 and we capture him. Seeing Kravchenko triggers Mason's brainwashing, and we can either resist the temptation to kill Kravchenko or we can give in to the bloodlust. On my playthrough, I chose to give in since I thought it would fit Mason's character. The Mullah Rahman then betrays us, sending Menendez's regards. We're left to die in the desert, and I love how Viktor Reznov makes a cameo appearance to once again save Mason. The 2025 missions in Black Ops 2 center around the hunt for Menendez, so who is this guy? Raul Menendez is a fictional drug lord who ran a massive operation in Nicaragua. He's the main antagonist of the game and one of the coolest villains in any Call of Duty. Let's start with some history to give context for his hatred of the United States. In 1919, the 18th Amendment to the US Constitution was ratified, banning the transportation, manufacture, and sale of alcohol. The intentions behind this law were good. People wanted to reduce alcohol's harmful impact on society. However, banning alcohol only resulted in increased criminal activity as organized gangs grew rich from selling alcohol. So in 1933, the 21st Amendment was passed, repealing the 18th Amendment and making alcohol legal again. A few decades later, the US government decided to try prohibition again, this time with drugs. In 1970, the Controlled Substances Act was passed by Congress and signed by President Nixon. Responsibility for enforcing the law fell to the newly created Drug Enforcement Agency, or DEA, in 1973. Nixon declared a war on drugs, calling illegal drug use public enemy number one. Shockingly, this didn't stop Americans from using drugs, and counterproductively it led to the growth of a massive drug production and smuggling industry in Latin America. Fast forward to the 1980s, and Ronald Reagan expanded the war on drugs. He signed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which made drug enforcement more punitive instead of focusing on rehabilitation. This resulted in the arrest and imprisonment of millions of Americans for using, selling, or owning drugs. Although the laws became harsher, drug use remained an issue in the US and the drug cartels became richer and richer. Menendez got rich off the illegal drug trade, and it's interesting that he's based in Nicaragua. Throughout the mid-20th century, Nicaragua was controlled by the Somoza family, a political dynasty that was supported by the United States. In 1961, a rebel group called the Sandinista National Liberation Front, or FSLN, was founded by college students in Managua, the capital of Nicaragua. Throughout the 60s, the Sandinistas gathered support among college students, farmers, small business owners, and other anti-Somoza elements in society, including Marxists. By the 70s, the group was large enough to begin a campaign of kidnappings and guerrilla warfare against the government. In January 1978, massive riots broke out in Managua, and by July 1979, the FSLN successfully overthrew the Somoza family. President Carter tried to work with the new Sandinista government, but when Ronald Reagan was elected, he implemented an anti-communist approach to Latin America. The Reagan administration started funding the Contras, a collection of conservative counter-revolutionary groups in Nicaragua. But the US Congress passed a couple of laws called the Boland Amendment prohibiting American support for the Contras, so if Reagan couldn't do it openly, he would do it in secret. In late 1986, news broke about American arms shipments to Iran. This was especially embarrassing for the US because a few years earlier, the US had tried to persuade other countries not to sell weapons to Iran. National Security Council member Oliver North came up with the plan to use the money from the arms sales to Iran to pay for supporting the Contras. When Congress investigated the arms sales to Iran, the Contra connection was revealed, and it all blew up in the Iran-Contra scandal. Oliver North was one of 11 people convicted on felony charges, although they were all eventually pardoned or dismissed. The real-life Oliver North worked with Treyarch in 2012 as an advisor for Black Ops 2, and he even plays himself in the game, making a cameo appearance when Hudson shows up to pick up Mason before the first mission. Throughout the Iran-Contra situation, the dictator of Panama, Manuel Noriega, offered to help the US in their support of the Contras. In the game, Mason, Hudson, Woods, and Noriega lead a group of Panamanian soldiers in a raid of Menendez's house in Nicaragua. Menendez supported the Sandinista government, so we're trying to capture him. At first, the Panamanian soldiers capture Menendez, but then Noriega releases him, calling it a favor. Menendez hears the screams of his sister and rushes back to his house. Woods, wanting revenge for his imprisonment in Angola, throws a grenade at Menendez, which misses and kills his sister Josefina. This sets up Menendez's hatred for the US and the CIA, establishing his motivations as a villain. Chronologically, the next mission takes place during the US invasion of Panama in 1989. The objective of the mission is to capture Manuel Noriega. Likewise, in real life, the invasion of Panama, codenamed Operation Just Cause, was also aimed at deposing Noriega. Let's check out the historical context for this final flashback mission. In the late 1800s, France began construction of a canal in Panama, which was part of Colombia back then, to try to make a shortcut between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. In 1902, the project was purchased by the United States. The next year, President Theodore Roosevelt sent U.S. Navy ships to the region in support of Panama's independence from Colombia. In 1904, the U.S. took control over the canal zone, inheriting a messy operation from the French. The canal was completed in 1914, and the U.S. maintained control over the canal zone throughout the 20th century. In 1977, President Carter signed an agreement with the dictator of Panama, Omar Torrijos, that on December 31, 1999, control over the canal would finally be given back to Panama. Torrijos died mysteriously in a plane crash in 1981, and 2 years later, Manuel Noriega became the de facto ruler of Panama. Noriega had been the head of intelligence under Torrijos, and as such had a long-lasting relationship with the CIA. Even in the 70s, the US government was aware of his involvement in drug trafficking, as well as the fact that he was selling information on the US to Cuba. But Noriega was an anti-communist, so in the midst of the Cold War, the US was willing to support him, needing allies in the region, especially given the conflict in Nicaragua. In 1989, Noriega attempted to rig Panama's elections to ensure his victory, but the US wanted him to step down. On December 15th, the Panamanian government declared war on the United States. After an incident that following night, which resulted in the death of an American soldier, President George H.W. Bush authorized an invasion of Panama to depose Noriega, set for December 20th, 1989. The invasion was quick. Within a few days, the US military had control over Panama City. Noriega took refuge in a mission of the Holy See. In a weird turn of events, the American forces played loud rock music day and night in an attempt at psychological warfare to force Noriega out. On January 3, 1990, Noriega surrendered to the US and was flown to Miami, where he was convicted of drug trafficking, racketeering, and money laundering 2 years later. Fun fact, in 2012, Manuel Noriega sued Activision for their portrayal of him in Black Ops 2, but in 2014, a California judge sided with Activision, saying that their First Amendment rights outweighed Noriega's right of publicity. In the game, the mission objective is not actually to capture Noriega, but to use him to trade in a prisoner swap for Menendez. We escort Noriega stealthily through the city to the Panama Canal, where we meet for the swap. Menendez is brought out with a hood over his head, and Woods is told to take the shot. It's then revealed that the hooded man was not Menendez, but Mason. I messed up and shot him in the head, so Mason died in my playthrough, but if you shoot him anywhere except the head, Mason ends up surviving. Woods tries to kill Noriega for betraying us, but he's captured by Menendez. Menendez kills Hudson right in front of us and blows off Woods' kneecaps with a shotgun, which explains why Woods is in a wheelchair in 2025. The scene ends with David, Mason's son, mourning his father as he sits over the body. So that's all the flashback missions in Black Ops 2. The remainder of the game features David Mason's hunt for Menendez. I won't be discussing how that story plays out in detail, but I thought it would be interesting instead to see how accurate Black Ops 2's prediction of 2025 was in real life. In Call of Duty in Our Geopolitical Reality, published on October 2, 2024, author Jack Dolgarian compares Black Ops 2's predictions of 2025 with our current global situation. Dolgarian notes that there are three themes throughout the game that are eerily similar to our own time. The notion of Cold War II pitting the West versus China, the use of cyber attacks and drone warfare, and the impact of social media on geopolitics. In Black Ops 2's vision of 2025, China has formed the Strategic Defense Coalition, or SDC, to promote its interests at the expense of the West. Depending on your success or failure in the side missions, Russia, India, and Iran may or may not join this coalition. On February 4, 2022, just weeks before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping met in Beijing, declaring that both nations had no limits to their commitments to each other. In the aftermath of the Russia-Ukraine war, with the US and Europe not purchasing oil and natural gas from Russia, Putin's regime has become ever more dependent on China and India as customers. And while Iran has not solidified a formal alliance with China, in May 2021, the two countries signed a 25-year cooperation pact, which includes political, strategic, and economic commitments. Furthermore, Iran has supplied Russia with Shahed drones to be used against Ukraine. In Black Ops 2, a major component of Cold War II is China's reduction of rare earth mineral exports to the US. This is a scary real-world possibility because China processes over 90% of the world's rare earth metals, which are used for so much of our modern technology, including the production of computer chips. If China were to stop selling these materials to the US and the West, it would severely damage our ability to operate and produce advanced electronics used for civilian and military purposes. On top of all that, China's Belt and Road Initiative aims to unify Eurasia through land-based trade infrastructure. They want to create a modern-day Silk Road to compete with the US's dominance of global maritime trade routes. Black Ops 2's depiction of a possible Cold War II is eerily possible. The Russia-Ukraine war became a proxy war for the US versus Russia. The Israel-Hamas war has led to difficulties in international shipping as tensions with Iran continue to grow, and the China-Taiwan issue remains a potential flashpoint if China chooses to invade the island. While things today are not as dire as the 2025 in Black Ops 2, it certainly gives food for thought. The second relevant theme that Dulgarian discusses is that our reliance on modern technology is a potential weakness. In Black Ops 2, Menendez infiltrates an American aircraft carrier and takes control over fleets of drones, sending them to attack the US and China in order to incite a global war. Dulgarian explains that cyber attacks are often difficult to trace and that if one on this scale were to take place, it could potentially incite a larger war as confusion, fear, and miscommunication push world leaders to take drastic action. We've seen massive cyber attacks in recent years. On May 7, 2021, the Colonial Pipeline oil system based in Houston, Texas, was hit with ransomware, causing the company to shut down the pipeline for 5 days. The shutdown led to panic buying of gasoline and a declaration of emergency by President Biden as the situation was addressed. This was the largest cyber attack on oil infrastructure in American history so far. Cyber attacks are commonplace now, but as of yet, nothing of the scale shown in Black Ops 2 has happened, at least not yet. But drone warfare is absolutely a major feature of real-life war in the 2020s. In Black Ops 2, there are these massive walking armored drones armed with machine guns, and while that is still fictional, we've seen drones used for surveillance and combat operations in both the Russia-Ukraine war and the Israel-Hamas war. In addition to the traditional flying drones, we've also seen the use of underwater drones by the Houthi rebels in their attacks on international shipping in the Red Sea. The invisibility modules shown in Black Ops 2 are still totally fictional, but the emphasis on drone warfare is eerily relevant to the world today. The last major theme in Dulgarian's article, and perhaps the most unsettling, is the use of social media to engage in information warfare. In Black Ops 2, Menendez's group Cortes DA uses YouTube and other social media platforms to spread their messages to audiences around the world. Unless you live under a rock, you've heard of the power of social media to spread disinformation. Social media companies use insanely complicated algorithms to show you videos that you're likely to click on. They do unimaginable amounts of data gathering, spying on you to determine what will trigger you to click on a video or otherwise engage with online content. This creates rabbit holes like the Round Earth conspiracy, Pizzagate, one-sided reporting on conflicts around the world, and so much more. These algorithms prey on your susceptibility to confirmation bias, which is to accept new information that agrees with your pre-existing worldview. The best propagandists in history use this to manipulate the masses into being complicit in some of the worst atrocities in modern history. The Germans in World War II played into people's pre-existing anti-Semitism to brand Jews as responsible for Germany's problems. The Soviets played into envy, greed, and utopian naivete to coerce their population into complicity with the enslavement and execution of millions. But if someone like Menendez wanted to sow chaos around the world, they wouldn't need to rely on speeches, movies, posters, or books. They can build a following on social media and spread their message online. Black Ops 2 came out in 2012, shortly after the Arab Spring. This movement in 2010 and 2011 involved the use of Twitter to spread anti-government messages and organize protests, resulting in the overthrow and destabilization of countries across the Middle East and North Africa. It's easy to laugh off Cortes DA as an obviously evil organization, but have you ever taken time to think about how you've been manipulated by social media? After all, you're using YouTube right now. A couple other things I noticed in Black Ops 2's 2025 missions were the presence of General David Petraeus as Secretary of State in the game. In real life, Petraeus served as the director of the CIA in the Obama administration when Black Ops 2 was being developed. Given his influence in the Iraq War and relevance at the time, it makes sense that Treyarch would imagine him in a position of power in 2025. Another cool detail was the presence of a fictional aircraft carrier, the USS Barack Obama. Obama has not had a vessel named after him yet, but since Black Ops 2 came out while he was president, it makes sense that Treyarch would imagine a ship named after him in 2025. So is Black Ops 2 an accurate representation of the year 2025? No. Does it have several themes that are similar to our world today? Definitely. I had a blast playing this game for the first time. Thank you so much to everyone who encouraged me to cover it. If you enjoyed this video and maybe learned something along the way, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in Black Ops 6. Peace out for now.